Welcome to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Janie Herman and I'm the manager of adult programming here at the library. It's my great pleasure to introduce our author for tonight, but first a few quick housekeeping items. Please note that this room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-Coil technology. You can go ahead and turn that on if you have a device for that. If not, we do have some headphones over on the side. Just raise your hand and we can run some over to you if you're having problems with hearing the speaker. We kindly ask that you silence electronic devices and hold your questions, as there will be a chance for audience question and answer at the end of the presentation. We'd like to extend our thanks to Lavish Books of Princeton for being our bookseller today. And now to introduce our speaker. Becky Diamond has had a varied career combining writing and research as a food writer, librarian, and historian. Her previous book, which she spoke about here at the library 2015, was called The $1,000 Dinner, and it told the unique story of a 19th century Top Chef style competition between Philadelphia restaurateur Jane Parkinson and the Delmonico family of New York. The result was a luxurious 17-course feast that helped launch fine restaurant dining in America as we know today. It's a really fascinating book. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. She is also the author of Mrs. Goodfellow, The Story of America's Cooking School, which was a successful 19th century pastry chef, and she also ran an innovative cooking school for young women, a Philadelphia first. And tonight we are here for her latest publication, The Gilded Age Cookbook, that transports the reader back in time to lavish banquet tables set with snow-white linen tablecloths, delicate china, and sparkling crystal glasses. The cuisine in this book features rich soups, juicy roasts, and luscious desserts, and as well as historic images and artistic photography. Gilded Age details entertaining stories of celebrities from the era, like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Rockefellers, are all melded with historic menus and recipes that are updated for modern kitchens. So for those of us that are here in person in the community room, we have been enjoying some samples from the book, yummy jumbo cookies, as well as some delicious blueberry cake. And we are all ready and eager to learn more about dining in the Gilded Age. Welcome, Becky.
Welcome everyone. It's so great to see you all and online as well. So yes, dining in the Gilded Age. Let's get started. First, I just wanted to give just a little more background. Janie gave a really nice, some information about what I've done in the past. But yes, I'm a food writer, librarian, historian, and researcher. I love food and food history. And through my first book, Mrs. Goodfellow, I learned a lot about the history of Philadelphia as well, which really helped get her backstory. And then the $1,000 Dinner. And all the food that I had to research, I had to go through recipes and kind of reconstruct them and update them for modern times. So when I was doing that, I was putting that on my blog. And that's what led me to think about writing the Gilded Age Cookbook, because I had all these recipes that I had taken the time to really go through and say, hey, this is what the old recipe was, but I could update it for modern times. And I just really focused on that age and had a fascination with it. So that's how that all got started. Now let's go into what it would be like dining in the Gilded Age. So if you had been invited to a dinner in the Gilded Age, you would have been greeted with a table very similar to this. It would have been a long white table with the linen tablecloth, china, dish, crystal, all kinds of beautiful cut dishware and silverware. And they like to also have these types of flower arrangements, like a lot of floral arrangements and sugar sculptures and other edible sculptures, believe it or not, would be on the table. So this is what it would have looked like. And what would you have eaten if you had been there? Well, it definitely would have been multi-course, and they always started off with oysters as a first course. You definitely would have had oysters, usually raw on the half shell. And then you would have moved into some kind of soup. It would usually be a clear soup or maybe like a turtle soup. And then you would move into a fish course. which could have been roasted or grilled somehow and served with wine. All of these dishes I'm talking about would have been paired with different wines too. And then you would have had an entree, and I know today we think of entree as more the main part of the meal, but it really, the word entree means entrance or beginning. So it would have been served early in the meal, and typically, like, think about, you know, how we have appetizers today, or like small plates. That's how I think of what their entree would have been. You know, just really crafted, you know, delicate foods that people really enjoyed, and the chef wanted to show off his or her skills. And then they would move into a roast, which would usually be like a chicken or some kind of poultry, and or some kind of meat. Then a palate cleansing sorbet or some kind of punch. Then on to game dishes. It could have been, again, some kind of waterfowl, like canvasback duck, or maybe snipe or something like that. And then on to cold dishes, which would have been, like we think of aspics today, so like gelatin, cold cooked food set in like a gelatin mold. That way they could craft them again and build these beautiful kind of sculptures out of them, and then they could also, it helped preserve the foods as well. These were the days before a lot of refrigeration, so that was helpful to have things set in aspic. And then moving into desserts, they would have several courses of desserts typically. So that's, you know, from soup to nuts basically is what you would have been served. And then usually any of the men would have typically left the table and gone off and had cigars and maybe some nice port wine, and the women could move into, like they called it the parlor, and have their own, maybe some brandy or something too, or sherry and bonbons. And then they would regroup at the end of the night after that. So it was a long evening. I don't know how they did it all in that amount of time. But so let's go into a little bit about the Gilded Age and what it was. It was really, it started in, I always say, around the 1870s. Different historians have different time frames. I like to say that it lasted till about 1910. Some people say 1900. But anyway, it's that 30 to 40 year time frame at the end of the 19th century. And it was the term coined by Mark Twain from his famous book, The Gilded Age. And the reason it was called that is because it glittered with gold on the surface, all this wealth. But then underneath, you know, there was this layer of some corruption in order for them to build out the railroads and other steamship transportation. There wasn't any regulation at the time, so they kind of all did what they wanted to do and make their money in the way, you know, just kind of every man for himself. And as the rich got richer, though, others worked to help propel them forward, you know, either being servants, and there were people living in tenement living, like in this photograph at the bottom there. So even though there were those who were making a lot of money, there was also this aspect of people not having as much. But it was also a time of innovation and technology, and that's really what fueled this greed during the Gilded Age. So now we're going to move into, believe it or not, cooking schools are very important to this era. You know, today we think of when you go to a culinary school, you're going to either work in a restaurant or maybe something else in the food industry, but it wasn't like that then. It was more of a way to teach the upper class ladies how to put on a good, you know, fine dining meal. And then also it moved into also teaching the servants how to cook the meals that the people really dictated that they needed to have for their fine dining. And French cuisine was all the rage, but many New Yorkers complained that the servants didn't know how to cook or make these, you know, meals that they really wanted to make. So using this as an example, a lot of times they would hire French chefs, bring them over from France. And so Marietta Stevens, the wife of Perrin Stevens, she paid her French chef $45 a week, which is, as you can see, about $1,200 today. So that was one way to do this in order to get the types of food and dining that they wanted. But other people then also had, they had to help their servants along to do what they, to cook the food that they needed. So the servant issue, what happened is there were a lot of people who started arriving in New York in the mid 1800s, especially Irish people coming during the potato famine. And these Irish girls who came over really were raised in households where they had zero experience with some of the technologies that we had here, such as cook stoves, the way that we were cooking here was, a little bit different, and the types of food. So they didn't have that experience. So many people complained, things are getting burned, they're unpalatable, they're just not seasoned properly. So they needed to have people to help them along and really help to know what kind of equipment that was needed to cook the types of food that they wanted. So there was this French chef named Pierre Blot. He had come from France in the mid 19th century, and he saw this as an opportunity. He realized that there was this, everyone wanted to eat French food, but there wasn't any formal way that people could get taught how to do that. So he started this New York Cooking Academy, and I love how he designated himself a professor of gastronomy. But he really did so much to help propel cooking schools forward. The fact that he held classes for ladies and servants, so ladies would go and take these cooking classes because he was so charismatic and just very much a showman. He would have these lectures, and they would be sold out. People just really loved to hear him talk. So the ladies would take the classes themselves and then send their servants as well to the classes. So he had a huge market, and in fact, even sometimes bachelor men would take his classes, believe it or not. He had specific classes just for bachelor men that needed to know how to cook some food too. So I thought that was very, very interesting for the time frame. So, and he just had this determination that he just, like American food just needs to be elevated to the French level. So he just was really determined to do that. And so Juliet Corson was another cooking instructor, and she was one of his proteges. And because Blot's Cooking Academy was so successful, it really started this cooking school revolution. And came in front of people that thought, hey, we're going to help out with it. People like the Vanderbilts. Margaret Vanderbilt Shepherd, who was the granddaughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt, she helped Juliet Corson develop this New York cooking school, and it was at the YWCA, and she would teach classes there. The same kind of model as Pierre Blot, where she was teaching debutantes as well as working women. Many of the debutantes and the working women took classes together also in this United Charities building in New York City. So the wealthy girls would take their classes during the day, and they would often show up in their finery, their white gloves and caps and dresses, and they often wouldn't even take off their gloves. It was just a way for them. They just liked to see what was going on with the cooking, but they didn't want to get their hands dirty, most of them. So it was simply a way to pass the time, and then also a lot of young ladies, taking cooking classes, their parent or their mothers especially would say, you need to take these cooking classes so that you know how to put on a dinner party and get some etiquette and such. So they didn't necessarily want to be there sometimes, but for the people that the working women, they would work all day and then they would go to the cooking classes at night. So it was such a different situation for each of them, but they were all, the two groups were taking classes together. And Emily Vanderbilt Sloan, she attended cooking school classes, and she was actually, she actually enjoyed it, and said to be an apt pupil. And she actually also gave money to charity at her wedding for money spent into the New York Cooking School. So she thought that it was a really important cause that these women need, learn to know the different cooking techniques, and also for the working women to have a career path going forward. Then they could work as cooks or in households as a way to make some money. Also, Margaret Vanderbilt Shepherd's daughter Edith showed a genuine interest, and she also was said to take in and enjoy these cooking classes. So it just really paved the way for cooking instruction in these public cooking lectures. So Sarah Tyson Rohr, she was from Philadelphia and had the Philadelphia Cooking School, and it was about the 1870s through the early 20th century. She was so popular, not only at the Philadelphia Cooking School, but she gave lectures throughout the country. So think about it. These are the days before there was no TV, there was no internet. You couldn't watch a YouTube video on how to make some kind of dish that you wanted to make. So she would do this in front of packed lecture halls. It was a form of entertainment, and she would travel around the country doing this. She's actually from Bucks County too, believe it or not, so kind of nearby. So that's like a fun fact about her. She was extremely popular at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. She had her own little platform there where people would just stand outside and wait and then get into this lecture hall, and she would give all these food demos. It was really, all these sold out lectures. And she often paired with food companies such as Baker's Chocolate or some baking soda or baking powder companies. So this was a marketing tool that both she and these companies were using to sell their products. She often would write up some recipes, and they would publish the little pamphlet, Baker's Chocolate or something, and then it just helped both her and these companies, in terms of marketing. And now we're going to move into ladies' luncheons. So these were really an integral part of the Gilded Age. Ladies had this circle of society that they really stayed within if they were people of means. And so by having these luncheons and attending other luncheons given by others in their circle, it was a way to form new connections, arrange plans for future get-togethers, pay off social obligations, and just really keep that whole circle going. They often would have a form of entertainment, such as maybe somebody's reading poetry or a vocalist or playing music. That would be part of this luncheon. And it really gained in popularity in the 1800s and was more frequently extended. It was given by a woman to other women, so it really was like a ladies' thing. And there were some club luncheons that were so ladies, women's associations, such as one was the Sedgley Club, which was a Philadelphia women's bike, barge, and canoe club. Actually, they would have their luncheons. The Topic Club was one that was a Philadelphia literary club. So there was all different types of these women's clubs that would have luncheons. And I feel like that still happens a lot today, actually. In fact, I've given talks to some of these clubs, and it's nice that they keep that kind of concept going. Now, some of the food that would have been served, I want to talk about lobster because this was one of the more frequently featured salads at a luncheon. A 1901 issue of Domestic Science Monthly said that luncheon salads should be rich, meaty, and sufficient, and that fish salads are better at lunch than at dinner, and that lobster stands first. So it was very popular. But actually, lobsters were just starting to be a status symbol. They were once considered a food for the poor, believe it or not. They were just so plentiful along the East Coast that they were, and even sometimes given to animals to eat. So, but what happened is once canning became available, and then also the railroads, they just started like canning a lot of the lobster, and they could send it to distance, like to the Midwest where they never could have lobster. So it just, they overfished it, became less available, and then more in demand. So that's kind of what we're in for, what we experience today, where lobster is just, more expensive and such. And then sponge cake. So sponge cake really was the quintessential cake of the Gilded Age. There was endless style and flavor combinations. And I think one reason it really became popular, two things. One was the invention of the rotary egg beater, which really was a time saver. Before that, women had to whip eggs by hand forever, sometimes almost like an hour, and they would delegate that task to their servants. So the egg beater really sped things up, and it was a life changer. And then also baking powder. Chemical leavenings came on the scene really in full force during the Gilded Age, and before that, they didn't. Eggs were the way that would make cakes rise. So that was another thing that really, once that happened, you could see a lot of tall layer cakes come on the scene. And with sponge cake, most of the time it could be served plain like this with just a sprinkling of confectioner's sugar, but they would also kick it up a notch, and add some whipped cream or fruit and flavoring such as lemon or orange, that sort of thing. So. And now tea parties, too, were similar to luncheons in that they were a way for ladies to kind of keep their little circle going and pay off their social obligations. Also a way to gain support for charitable causes. That was a big thing with these ladies' luncheons and organizations. And also they could showcase their latest fashions, like what are you wearing kind of thing, and other trends. So like a receiving line at a wedding almost, guests would come in, and the woman of the household would be situated in the door of the parlor, and then greet each guest, and the guest would go in and they would see the tea table set up like this, usually in the dining room, and had a crisp white linen tablecloth, flower arrangements. The tea service would be at one end. In specific, a lot of times they would do themes like with the colors or the flowers. So everything was like very dainty and elegant. And in addition to tea, and they would have coffee too, but they also had hot chocolate or hot. We think of it now today as hot cocoa, and it's the same thing, but it really isn't, and it definitely wasn't then. One thing, too, I want to say about chocolate is that it was, at this point, mainly a drinking beverage. Because of the way chocolate was hard to process to remove there's cocoa, like the butter fat, and it would separate. So once they figured out how to perfect that process, then it was added to many baked goods. But at this point, it was still mostly a drinking beverage. And so hot chocolate, if anyone's ever been to Europe, especially Belgium, they often bring still these pitchers of this really rich drinking chocolate, especially in the morning. And so it's like chocolate that they grate, and then they add milk and eggs and make it really rich with a lot of sugar, versus hot cocoa, which is lighter in color. And back then it was just like kind of grated cocoa beans blended with milk and water. And it was actually often served to people if they were ill. And people like Fanny Farmer, she was the Boston Cooking School instructor, she actually recommended it for children. She said it was a nutrient as well as a stimulant. And so and then really quick, I wanted to show you over here, you might wonder what this, so this is actually a hot chocolate set
that was in my mother's family. My aunt's here today, and so she remembers seeing this on the table as they were growing up. And it's beautiful. But that's how important hot chocolate was, is that they had their own sets for it and everything. So it's very cool. And tea foods. Now, we have teas today, like, you go to a tea room or whatever, and it's often, to me, it's like more of a meal, but the teas that they had weren't necessarily a meal, and I always say, I don't even know how much people were really eating, because I think they were doing a lot of socializing, but they had to have these things set out. And there were, it also was a way for young people to meet, so teas weren't necessarily always for just women. Sometimes young people could go, and it was a way that they could be chaperoned in front of their parents, and so they would often be around the tea table tasting some of these treats as well. But typically it was the bread and butter sandwiches, some little tea cakes, some kind of fruit like strawberries, maybe some other kind of berries. If it was in the wintertime, they would have bouillon to drink or to sip on, maybe some bonbons and nuts, and then these frozen drinks. So it could be like frozen cherries or frozen coffee. Sometimes they'd have little squares of ice cream in little packages. So those were the typical tea foods that they would have. And so then men had their own forms of kind of getting together, and in that they had these eating clubs, which were also sometimes called glutton clubs or dining clubs. And it was a way really to share information and socialize while having a good meal, and also just to talk about business, and really it was a networking possibility. They could make business deals and just network and really have their own fun too, because especially this colony in Schuylkill in Philadelphia, it's also known as the Schuylkill Fishing Company or the Fish House Club. Some of you may have heard of Fish House Punch, which was their very potent drink that they would have as they would set up on the banks of the Schuylkill and fish and hunt, and then whatever they caught, they would cook right there, right on the riverbank, and then wash it down with this Fish House Punch and just have a jolly old time together. And then there was also the Clover Club that was formed later in time in the 1800s, and they also just really they would get together and have a fine meal and just socialize. And they served their meals actually on a table that was shaped like a four-leaf clover. That's why they were called the Clover Club. This is just a menu also shaped as a four-leaf clover. And it was reserved specifically for the monthly dinners that they would have. And they often had invited guests to help partake in their merriment. I had read a quote at one point that said they think the Clover Club was really the beginning of the roast. And when I say that, I mean when somebody's roasted, like kind of thing, because it was all like tongue-in-cheek and fun. So one time they hosted Mark Twain in 1885, and he was apparently a little surprised at how rowdy they all got and how it went on for 5 hours, and they just really liked to have a good time. And this club still meets today, actually, as a club for social enjoyments and cultivation of literary tastes. So it's very important in the Philadelphia area. And now I want to talk about, so there was actually a group of African Americans who had their own circle of activity during the Gilded Age, especially in the New York area. And they founded this New York and Newport Ugly Fishing Club, for a love of piscori, pleasure of fishing. Just kind of like the Schuylkill Fishing Club. And many of them, this was the founding member, Phyllis Augustus White, and many of the members had moved to Brooklyn after the Civil War, and they found jobs as doctors and pharmacists and ministers, teachers, and they all just got together and had their own banquets and balls and debutante parties and everything. It was a real thriving social scene, and that was the wealth of its 20 members in 1883. And they like to discuss things such as politics, humor, education, poetry. So they had their own, just all these different meetings that they would get together and have their social activities. And now we're going to go into dinner parties, banquets, and balls. I mean, this is what we think of when we think of the Gilded Age, right? Like all these, banquets that they had. So it was a way for rich Americans really to show off their wealth. And just all this excess. And so as families started to move away from the central parts of cities, like think of the suburbs, like in New York, they started to move more uptown. Philadelphia, they moved in different suburbs. The time for the dinner evening meal was pushed back, like to be later in the evening, so the man of the household could partake in socializing when he got home. So that was one reason that their dinners started to get later and later. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there was all these multi-course meals were very popular and common, from oysters, soup, fish, entrees, all the way to coffee and dessert. And we can't talk about these banquets and balls without talking about Mrs. Astor and Lord McAllister. So there was, they were the epitome of these lavish banquet dinners and debutante balls, and they flaunted really the wealth and defined who was into society. And they had this list of the 400, which was the only people. So Caroline's in the middle there. Who she and Ward deemed that they were socially worthy. So they had this list, and if you were on the list, you could be invited to their parties. If not, well, too bad, kind of thing. And apparently the 400 came from, that was the limit of the people that could fit in Caroline's huge ballroom. But then I was reading that there was some debate about that. An 1889 New York Tribune article said that was nonsense, that Charles Delmonico created the 400 when he built a hall at one of the Delmonico locations that would hold that number of people. But, I mean, people typically think that Caroline and Ward are the ones that, came up with that list of the 400. And now people like the Vanderbilts were new money, so they were not in this, circle of the 400. But Alva Vanderbilt, who was the wife of William, he was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. In 1883, she had this really lavish housewarming ball in this was her new French chateau-style mansion, and she purposely snubbed Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, forcing her to call on her and then let her in this elite circle. So if anyone watches the Gilded Age TV show, that's what the inspiration for the ball where Bertha Russell throws. But so it was Alva that really, for the whole Vanderbilt family, she's the one who really worked her way in and pushed and said, we want to be into this society of wealthy people. And now, so banquet garnishes, a lot of the food was just over the top, in presentation particularly. So these game dishes on the left, as you can see, a lot of times they would leave the head on the game or include real feathers, like that dish at the top. They would have pheasants with real feathers, garnishings. Other game birds, they would do the same. They also had these skewers that would be put in the top of different foods called atolets or hatolets, and they would have coxcombs and truffles and mushrooms, just little bits that they would put on there too and kind of stack up. So it just was a way to embellish food and make it just as showy as possible. And then the restaurant industry too really was exploding at this time because there were so many people moving into cities, especially New York. If you take 1847, there's a tourist guide that estimated the total of New York restaurants to be a little over 100, but then by the 1860s there were over 5,000. So it really exploded. There was establishments not only for the wealthy, like Delmonico's, but also that catered to the growing middle class too. So it was really, it was just a booming industry. Delmonico's particularly, I mean, they had several locations over during the 19th century, including Fifth Avenue and 14th Street, which is, they hosted Charles Dickens there in 1868. So they had plenty of balls and dinners, and just, it was the place to be often at Delmonico's. Meet me at Delmonico's. And then Sherry's was another one. So Louis Sherry, he was a savvy and smart entrepreneur. He really had his finger on the pulse of the Gilded Age, becoming one of the most revered and connected restaurateurs of the era. By 1890, he had this Sherry's location on Fifth Avenue, and he's situated directly across from Delmonico's. He knew his competition, he knew where to be, and luckily he also, he catered for the era's famous 400 because he had the backing of Caroline Astor. She was one of his regular customers and really endorsed him, and it was rumored that she actually helped fund him too, but he said, no, I climbed the ladder to success on my own, and really, just by knowing what people wanted and catering to them in that way. So, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about some outdoor activities, because just like today, the Gilded Age was a time where people liked to eat out of doors, and they had different activities specific to the time of year. So particularly their strawberry fetes and festivals were really popular. You can imagine that after the winter, people just wanted to get outside, and they would have strawberries in every shape and form that you can think of: strawberry shortcake, strawberry whip, strawberries and cream, and they were all served at these kind of events, which were often held as fundraising events. It was a way churches and schools could get some money and just host them on their grounds typically. So just to show you, strawberry shortcake being one of the most popular desserts, or dishes that they would serve at these events. And they started popping up in American cookbooks in around the mid-1800s. And the early versions would have been flatter because, as I mentioned before, chemical leavenings hadn't come on the scene. But once baking soda, you think today baking soda biscuits or baking powder biscuits, I mean, that's what really makes them fluffy and rise. So that's, they just exploded in popularity too. And ice cream socials are another thing that, another type of event that were really popular. We still have them often today, but definitely back then. Also, they were held as fundraisers, especially by churches and schools. And again, without air conditioning, I think we take it for granted today with, we're in a nicely air-conditioned room now, but they didn't have any air conditioning, so they would want to just go outside and be in the shade. The ice cream would be cool. It could, be refreshing for them. Women would often wear these long white dresses, and men like these wide-brimmed hats, to keep the sun out. So it was just a whole entertaining event for people to get together. And we have to talk about ice cream cones because so these earlier ice cream socials, they would have had to serve their ice cream either in glass dishes or maybe paper cones. They were available by the 1850s. But at the World's Fair in 1904 in St. Louis, this was the invention of the ice cream cone. So this gentleman was selling Persian waffles next to an ice cream cone stand, and the two men got together, rolled the waffles into a cone, and filled them with the ice cream, and then it was born, and they started this cornucopia ice cream company, and it just really took off after that, and just one little, by chance, they were next to each other, and then that's what happened, so it was just kind of fun. And now picnics. Picnics weren't new to the Gilded Age, but it's just kind of fun to talk about them and see how they differed a little bit versus a type of picnic that we would want to have now. And I just love this little picture of these ladies having their fine picnic. So there was a book, 1891 book by Mrs. Grace Townsend, and it's like this how-to of how to do a picnic at the time. And she has all these like tongue-in-cheek kind of suggestions, like cookies always taste better than cakes at a picnic, and if you're taking rolls, wrap each two buttered and lay them together in tissue paper. So kind of similar how we wrap things, wrap them up today. She also had instructions for even to take ice cream. She would say to put it in a freezer and wrap it in a heavy carpet to keep it cool. So that was their version of a cooler, an igloo, their igloo cooler or whatever. And then even lemonade, she talks about that. Again, we take it for granted. Oh, we can just get some bottles of Country Time or Snapple or something. But back then, they had to make up their lemonade. And so to take it to a picnic, she recommended doing like almost a sugar syrup with the lemons. Squeeze the lemons, add them to a glass jar with the sugar, and then add the water when you get to the actual picnic site. So you can put a little of that syrup into each glass and then add water, and then you have your lemonade. So it just was, she had all these ingenious little methods for picnicking. And then, the picnic favorite today is potato chips, and they actually come from these Saratoga chips, which were a Gilded Age invention. The origins are from this Moon's Lake house in Saratoga Springs, New York, and the legend has it that in 1853 there was a fussy customer. Some say it was Cornelius Vanderbilt. They had these Moon's fried potatoes, they were called, and he kept sending them back saying they're too thick, I want them sliced thinner. So the chef, his name was George Crumb, he said, okay, I'll slice them really, really thin and fry them in oil. And he loved them, and then the concept took off, and you can see, if you start to look at recipes right after that, it's just, these Saratoga chips are in like every cookbook after that. So it's just funny how quickly some things just take hold. And then also the summer entertaining would move to the beach areas, especially Newport, Rhode Island. They would have these exclusive golf and tennis luncheons, balls and dinner parties. So that was one popular location. The cooler Rhode Island shoreline really attracted the millionaires from New York specifically, but also as far away as St. Louis, even South Carolina. So, they had all this money and they built these expensive mansions, not only in Newport but also in Narragansett. So, all different locations to escape the heat of the city. And East Coast beaches, like a little further down, were also popular destinations. Philadelphians favored Atlantic City and Cape May. So this is the Haddon Hall dining room in Atlantic City. And I found this travel guide from the 1890s, and it's really quite funny comparing Atlantic City of that time to today, because so it claims that thousands are attracted to Atlantic City to enjoy the magnificent surf bathing, sailing, and fishing. Beautiful avenues lined with shade trees afford excellent opportunities for driving and riding. You can stroll through the markets. It's well supplied by large cities.
and the ocean water. So I think, they were getting the fish and serving the fish, for dinners. But they also even recommend the sewers as a selling point. They say the sewerage system is exceptionally good, and the supply of pure, wholesome water at the main line is apparently inexhaustible. So it's just really funny to compare. Think of today, it's just all casinos, and not all, but so just the differences, or whatever. But and then also New Yorkers, they like to go to Coney Island, Seagirt, and Long Branch. Long Branch was really popular for a lot of people to go to, and they were all more accessible via rail, so the railroads would go to these different locations too, and again, they would have been a refreshing relief from the heat of the cities. And they often had oyster roasts and clam bakes, so that was another popular summer activity. At the Jersey Shore, they would have these piles of, they'd build a big bonfire, and they'd roast oysters, clams, fresh corn, other fish, just right there on the open, in the coals. Or they would put a pan and put the oysters or clams in the pan. They would open up. Some people would just eat them right from the pan. Other people, like maybe a little butter, salt and pepper. But it was a really popular activity to have on the beach. And there was even like a whole, as you can see from this quote, they have like a whole, whatever, like just the methodology had to be specific often how to do it. So. And now I'm going to move into the holidays, because it was, again, like today, a very important time of year. Thanksgiving and Christmas were really the two most important planned out meals of the year. And especially for women, they had a lot to do in advance, as you can see in this picture, just a lot going on to prepare. And some had servants and some didn't. In any case, it was just a lot of prep work. And even I found this Ladies' Home Journal from 1894, and even has a quote about, just how the strain of preparing a dinner falls directly upon the woman of the household. So whether or not she has servants, it's just, all that prep work ahead of time. And just to show you, this is a Christmas dinner menu from 1897. And I like to show it because there's some things that we still have, like the turkey's on there, there's sweet potatoes, but there's several things that might look kind of unusual, like, I don't know how, some people might still have oysters, but that was popular. Deviled spaghetti, that recipe's featured in the cookbook. It's delicious. Every time I serve it, my son especially loves it. And because it's like macaroni and cheese, but it's with an egg sauce. So you hard-boil eggs and make like a white sauce and serve them in either little tiny dishes, or you can just put it in a casserole dish, but it's delicious. What else? Yeah, peas with turnip cups. So there's just, some things were similar, but there's these differences as well. Oh, and also celery. You're like, why would celery be on a Thanksgiving menu or a Christmas menu? Well, it was actually a really important thing during the Gilded Age. We think of it today, usually it's just like on a crudité platter. We might chop some up to put with chicken salad or tuna salad, but it was like celery back then. It was really hard to grow. It came from the Mediterranean, and it wasn't until later that people perfected, like there were different varieties and really perfected how to grow it. So it was a very exclusive thing to say, hey, I got some celery for my table. So this is actually a celery stand, like a celery vase. This again was in my family. And I always say to people, go home and see, you might have some vases in your collection that are really celery stands. Because that's what and people have told me, like later on, they're like, I think I have a celery stand. And so people now, I have a friend, he collects them now because he's just fascinated with them. But yeah, they would display it, and the people would eat it too, but it just was such a status symbol to have celery. It's just funny how these things fall out of favor, but very, very important. And then the desserts, I just wanted to show you
the plum pudding, centerpiece of all the Christmas desserts. It was always, always served. I mean, think about the Cratchit family, and A Christmas Carol even had plum pudding. So whether you were rich or not so rich, it was on the table, and it often was brought flaming to the table. They would light it up. And just a little bit about the ingredients. Plum pudding actually started out as a savory pudding, and it had meat in it and vegetables. It got sweeter over time, and it never really had plums in it, and it had dried plums, which are prunes. And then eventually, when other dried fruit became more available, this was in England in medieval. It started in the medieval times. Then they started adding other ingredients like raisins or currants, maybe some dried apple, the lemon peel. All those ingredients you see in that picture by the Gilded Age could have been incorporated in a plum pudding. Sometimes they would add liquor or milk or eggs to make it richer. It just really depended. And then since they phased out the meat, but they still kept suet, which is the protective fat around the kidneys of beef or mutton. And it's almost like lard today. Like when I bake my plum pudding, it almost smells like bacon. It's like bacon mixed with all these spices and sweet things. So that's what it keeps it, and it's what holds things together too. But yeah, it's just interesting. And then 12th night. So Gilded Age people really liked to continue the festivities to New Year's Day, and then 12th night, which was January 6th, the Feast of Epiphany. And they would have parties. Children were often given 3 gifts to celebrate the gifts that the wise men brought to baby Jesus. After their big dinner, they would have maybe a puppet show or some kind of parlor games, and then this rich 12th night cake. So there's different versions of how you cook it, but most of the time there was something inside the cake, either a coin, if there was a coin dropped, baked in there, then whoever got the piece with the coin could be the king for the evening. Some versions say you can put 3 beans in different places, and if you get one type of bean, you're the king, and others the queen, and then the jester, and then you can kind of continue the festivities by, I'm the king for the evening, and they would do all kinds of different things. So it was just a way to extend the holiday time. And also sometimes they would, at the end of the evening, take the greenery that had been up in the house, take it all down and put it in the fireplace, and it was a way to start the new year, all my cares are away kind of thing. So that's kind of a neat tradition to do that. So all of this really helped define the Gilded Age and its significance to culinary history. More people had the wherewithal to live in comfort and style. There was this growing middle class. There was, from innovation and technology, and people, the Black community coming out of being enslaved and having more and more opportunities. That was significant, as well as women having more opportunities too. There were women in New York City that had their own tea rooms, actually. So that was kind of interesting when I found that out. And the unique types of food that they saw reflected the era's marked changes in dining habits. And this style and excessiveness continue to be a source of wonder and fascination today. But it's also important to know, as I and reflect on, as I mentioned, that with all the glittering on top, just to be mindful of what was happening underneath as well socially. So both things are good to keep in mind. And that's it. I appreciate everyone coming here, and I'm happy to take any questions. This is just some information about my website and such. So.
Okay, so are there any questions? This was such a thorough presentation, Becky. It was really, really wonderful, and I learned so many fascinating things, especially like the story about the ice cream cone. It's hard to believe that it was not until 1904. Like, you would think it would have been around forever.
Yeah, I know.
So are there questions? Oh, here we have a question.
I'd love to hear you talk about your research process for figuring out what would have been fashionable food at the time. Were you looking at something like Ladies' Home Journal as a starting point, or archived menus? What is the starting point for determining popularity of food in a historical time period?
Yeah, you know, often, and I have to say this, and I'm a librarian too, so that's very helpful in searching for things. But, and I have to say, Google Books is wonderful, a wonderful resource, because once things are out of copyright, they can get scanned in Google Books. So I can do searches on recipes and really see, like, go back in time and see what was important and how it trended. Kind of thing, but exactly what you said too. You know, I can also look at old magazines, old books. What was on the menu? Like I look at people like Fanny Farmer because any books that have lists of menus is very helpful. Fanny Farmer, that Sarah Tyson Rohrer that I mentioned, she has just a whole book of menus, and that was fabulous in knowing what was trending, what was the most popular thing, and also in newspaper articles too, not as much with the food, but definitely the books and magazines and all those other sources, absolutely. Yeah, New York Public Library has their menus, the whole menu site, which is really fabulous. Library of Congress has a lot too. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, right here.
Thank you so much. So I was wondering when you were talking about Sarah Tyson Rohrer, was that it?
Rohrer.
And you were talking about how she worked with different food companies, and it was sort of a marketing thing for those companies. And immediately, and you were talking about Fanny Farmer too, and it immediately got me thinking of like Betty Crocker, who comes around, I think that's, a few decades later, like in the 20s or 30s, but I think like is a totally kind of invented character. Like there wasn't actually a Betty Crocker.
Right.
And
yeah.
so I guess I'm wondering if like, do you know though if those things are connected, like that idea that came up later of having these figures that would help market different foods and stuff?
I'm sure that I can't think of any that I researched from the Gilded Age or like early 1900s where they had something like that, but I think they were realizing the power of marketing with food and the types of marketing. And again, this was they had to think about how are they going to get in front of the most people. Like there wasn't the media that we have today, so it was like word of mouth. These pamphlets. I mentioned in the book about canned goods, and the pineapple especially was so popular because that was something where you could get it now. You could buy cans of pineapple, and before it was harder to get. And so they were marketing that through these pamphlet type of cookbooks. So, I mean, that's more of what I found, and also as a way. So Sarah Rohrer, when she would go to the World's Fair, she also was almost like one of those cooking shows where she was like, oh my gosh, like a super hyper kind of thing, because she was saying, don't use these types of things, because a lot of things were laced with things that weren't necessarily food products. And she was saying, don't buy this because this flavoring had, especially flavorings, extracts, the baking powder and soda. So, she would say, these are the ones that you should use, kind of thing. So, but I'm sure, like you were saying, it probably propelled from there, from that concept.
Okay, any more questions? I think you did such a thorough job. And again, it was a really great presentation, and Becky, it was just so wonderful to have you back here. So there's a few more cookies left. I think the blueberry cake, it was very popular. It was very moist and very delicious. And I want to thank you for baking for our audience and for your presentation. And Becky will be assigning books over here. We have them for sale from Librarian Books. And so let's get another round of applause, and thank you for coming out today.